On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, picking up the pieces after California's raging wildfires, but who ends up with the short end of the stick after a disaster? And vital lessons on relations between China and the U.S. Is cutthroat competition inevitable or manageable? And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Swathes of California are burning. Winds fuel the spread of flames, forcing hundreds of thousands of people to flee and leaving millions without power. A state of emergency has declared on Sunday. Well, fire doesn't discriminate. Americans are seeing the gap between how the rich and the poor cope with disaster. Before we talk to our panelists about the wildfires and the inequality they expose and many other issues related to this, here is the latest.
Oh my God, I'm so scared. Holy oh my God.
The inferno spread as many were sleeping.
Authorities say the raging northern California fires have already destroyed about 270 square kilometers.
These folks were so scared, they ditched their car and ran for their lives.
There you go. Go on.
Look at that.
No let-up from fierce winds fanning the flames in California. At least 6 homes were destroyed on Thursday in Southern California's city of San Bernardino, which is also the Golden State's poorest city of its size.
The latest U.S. Census report has found that California's poverty rate continues to be the highest in the country.
On Wednesday, the New York Times published a front-page article that said natural disasters were another prism through which California's vast income inequalities can be viewed. The report pointed out that wealthy residents were able to rebuild houses, sometimes worth more than the ones that burned down, while the poor, who lost everything, still had nothing. Research shows that houses in less affluent counties are much more likely to be uninsured. After an area has been scorched, it becomes even harder for people to afford insurance. A study published by the U.S. government said low-income Americans were also more likely to become homeless after a disaster. Skyrocketing home prices along the coast have pushed lower-income residents to end up living in the most fire-prone regions of the state. Preventive measures such as buying non-wood roofs and regularly clearing brush around their homes are out of reach for the elderly with little money. Meanwhile, the rich have the option to hire private firefighters that cost $3,000 a day.
On the divide between the rich and the poor in California, and really what should be the lessons behind this wildfire, let's talk to our panelists. We have Isabel Hilton in London, the CEO and editor of Dialogue.net. And also in Washington, we invited Matthew Wibbenmeyer, a fellow at the Resources for the Future. And in Panama, we have Charles Miller, the W.M. Keck Professor of Environmental Analysis and History at the Environmental Analysis Program of Panama College. Welcome to the three of you. I want to go to Professor Mr. Wibbenmeyer first about the latest in California. What do you make of the reasons behind the ongoing wildfire this year particularly?
So fires in California and the western United States more broadly have been increasing over the past several decades, but in the last several years in California especially, we've seen an especially dramatic increase in the size and severity of wildfires, above and beyond the trends that have been ongoing over decades. And this really dramatic increase in the past several years has been primarily driven by late season winds that California experiences coming down from the mountains and towards the coast that are now overlapping with the wildfire season, in part due to climate change. Rains are coming later, and the dry season is now overlapping with this windy season, and that's really what's been driving some of these fires over the last several years that have been so devastating.
Right. Is there a way to deal with it, Professor Miller, besides just firefighting?
Well, I think one of the things that we are seeing now is as those winds pick up, as the flames blow into canyons and ridgelines and valleys, is that's where people have now moved. And so this is really not a natural disaster, but actually a human-constructed one. We have built tens of thousands of homes. Upwards of 5 to 6 million people live in what the state of California calls high-severity fire zones. 20 years ago, that wasn't true. 40 years ago, that really wasn't true. And so what we're looking at is not just big fires. It's big fires that are interacting with the built landscape where human beings live. And that's why we're seeing so many tens of thousands of people evacuating in the face of these flames.
But then people would wonder, Professor Miller, why would these people chose to live in their place and build houses there?
That's a great question, and that's really a question that we have to pose continuously to the county governments, to local governments, because they're actually making the decisions to what's called green light subdivisions so that people can go up there and build. The reason other people are moving there, and partly because many of these places were beautiful, gorgeous landscapes, that's where people would like to live. Some of it has to do with these are more affordable homes than those in the central core of Los Angeles, for example, or San Francisco, where housing prices have skyrocketed. And some is that people who are retiring are seeking a lower income and a slower pace of life.
But on the other hand, Mr. Miller, we do understand that even in a rich state such as California, in which you would imagine sunshine, beautiful life, innovation, and many other things, there is a lot of wealth divide between the rich and the poor. May I go to you, Mr. Wiebenmeyer, about that too? Understand from the latest number, 2016 to 2018, 7.1 million people each year could not even afford the basic expenses of life. So what's going on with the state of California, you know, which only exposed to the rest of the world as a result of this wildfire?
You're right that inequality in California is high, but fires affect both the rich and poor, and I think I agree with Mr. Miller in saying that it's been sort of both groups, the rich and the poor, that have moved into high wildfire risk areas for different reasons. For the rich, frequently these are high amenity locations where they can be close to scenic areas that are very nice to live in most times of the year. But for the poor, often these are different types of areas can be lower cost of living. So it's really both, and so it's both groups that have been exposed to this increase in fire risk.
Yeah, to the fire risk, yes, but still, if it comes to whether or not to afford firefighters for you, private firefighters, of course there is a huge opportunity divide between the rich and the poor. So, Professor, I want to go to you, Professor Miller, once again about that. You know, we have seen stories coming out of LA, coming out of San Francisco, about the rich areas of the city and the poor areas of the city. We also have been hearing from tourists going to California, even in these big cities, mega cities, talking about safety issues. Crime rates are going up, as we have also witnessed. You know, there are many Chinese tourists going to those places as well. So a lot of people talk about that. So how do you see in fact, the wildfire exposed one of the phenomenons of a very rich state in the United States now as a result of many other reasons, the wealth gap. And what do you consider as the biggest reason for that?
Well, part of what we're seeing, certainly with firefighting, and as you've mentioned, private firefighters are now being hired to go to, for example, the Kardashians, Drake, and others. High-profile individuals with enormous wealth are able to hire private firefighters who will come in to protect their homes, maybe not others, but certainly theirs. And what that, that's an old story in Los Angeles and elsewhere, dating back to the 1980s. We have seen some of this privatization take place, and the gaps between communities that have these kinds of private firefighters as well as public and those areas that don't. And so some of this is fueled by individuals' wealth. Some of it is being fueled by insurance companies who want to protect those high-value assets, those houses, who are also helping to underwrite this process. There's a social justice issue in this regard that some have to depend upon public firefighters who can't get to every place and whose budgets are slashed. And others can fly in private firefighters to do the work for them.
Very interesting, because at the time of fires, it would expose a lot of things that we wouldn't notice, at least in front of the rest of the world on a daily basis. But on the other hand, Mr. Wittenmeyer, every country, every city, of course, there is a wealth divide of different degree, but this time California's is a little bit shocking.
Yeah, that's right. But I think it's important to note that regardless of the location, the wealthy will be less impacted and more able to adapt to climate events like wildfire, and the poor will be more impacted. And so I think regardless of the event you're talking about, that's a dynamic that's always at play. And
that's exactly the topic, Mr. Wittenmeyer. I want to lead both of you gentlemen too. That is, when there is climate change, for example, environmental issues, we talk about adjustment, right? Adaptation in a way, but also try to prevention. But which comes first? That's a very important question. And secondly, when the first front line is being already destroyed, what can we rely on now for the second front line so that we at least have some guardians for us? So what can we rely on? That's really the fire has been trying to, in a way, our discussions about the fire has been trying to reach. Professor Miller, may I go to you now?
Sure. So you've raised a really important issue, and this is as true in areas that are hit by typhoons or hurricanes, tornadoes, other kinds of disasters, that two things happen. One of which is those who have wealth can insulate themselves, protect themselves. Those with fewer resources are actually going to be much worse off over a longer period of time, and we know that's the case in places like Bangladesh, which we expect more than a third of it to go underwater. Just the sort of notion of climate refugees is going to be a tremendous drain on individuals' wealth, but also national prosperity. So these are things that, whether we're talking about mitigation, adaptation, or prevention, for me, we're now in the question of adaptation. We're not going to prevent climate change from happening and from having these accelerating impacts, whether it's fire, flood, hurricane, or whatever it may be. What we need to be thinking about is managing our retreat, stepping back from those places that we know, as fires are revealing once again this fall, with that we know will burn. Why we continue to do the things that we're doing is sort of the definition of insanity, to continue to do stuff that we know causes enormous harm and danger. But that's equally true on seacoasts. California, again, shows us that with sea level rise and collapsing cliff walls, that what we once took as an amenity zone, as a high-wealth, beautiful landscape, is actually a place of great danger. And so why are we still doing this? And so I think part of this is to recognize that the world that California helped to create no longer exists, and that we have to manage ourselves in different ways than we have been willing to do. And that's a very hard sell in the state of California, let alone other places.
It is a very hard sell. It is also a hard sell elsewhere in the world to let people really understand the danger that we are facing right now. But Mr. Wittenmeyer, California is a state that has been emphasizing on environmental protection and also a state very active in climate change issues. But obviously, the nature that we're facing is, as a whole, it doesn't matter whether one state really care about that and the others don't, and they all face the same fate, it seems. So it's quite ironic. But Mr. Wittenmeyer, what does it take for policymakers, particularly at federal level in your country, to notice the importance of it and be able to adjust the policies as we have witnessed over the past few years?
Well, it may take disasters like we're seeing in California or that we've seen along the Gulf Coast with hurricanes in the last several years. But you're right that there's a lot that the U.S. needs to do still to address climate change. And it's not something that one state, even a large state like California, can do alone to fix the problem. It needs to be the federal U.S. government as well as other countries around the world to address this.
But you know, Mr. Wittenmeyer, even as far as we are in China, we also understand that it's about the election. It's about politics also. So California is already a state well known for its political stance. I don't need to elaborate on that. And therefore, it's not going to be the battling ground for election. And therefore, the issues of California is not necessarily likely to be the focus of politicians for elections politics. So how would you be able to, you know, from a state like this, even though you're based now in Washington, D.C., be able to get across these messages? Do these kinds of crises really matter in politics? I thought politics originally was there in order to organize the society, in order to make sure some progress can be done and things can be served for the common people. But, you know, I know it's already changing the taste of it. I'm not naive, but still, I want to add that question, Mr. Wittenmeyer. What about that?
It's a great question. I wish policymakers here in Washington were taking greater notice of the fires and some of these other disasters around the U.S. And their links with climate change. And you're right, it's a question I think we just don't have a great answer to at the moment. How can we get policymakers to really take notice of some of these issues?
Professor Miller, COP25, even though it was suspended, hosted by Chile, we heard the news today, at least it's good news that Spain has taken on the responsibility. But how much can we expect by the international community also? It's not just about the state of California, it's not just about the United States, it's about the international community. After all, we have done so much, but it's so far away from the earlier task we set for ourselves. So every time we fall behind. Will this one be an encouraging one or another one that reflects upon the lessons while we fall behind again? I hate to say that, but you know, it's part of the reality.
No, you know, and I don't feel that my answer is cynical. I think it's actually realistic in the sense that we have gone through a series of international conferences. The rhetoric has always been good. Copenhagen and others have really sort of driven some of the dialogue. But what we have not seen is a real set of political changes that makes that rhetoric real. And I'm afraid that the next conference will be setting up a subsequent conference, which is essentially what we've seen, like a set of train cars hooking onto one another, but we don't know in which direction it's pulling.
All right. Ms. Hilton, finally, we're connected. I know there were some technical problems earlier, but your thoughts about COP25 later this year, very briefly, 40 seconds.
About the COP?
Yes.
It's time for action, really. I mean, next year we're supposed to have the COP in Glasgow, which boosts climate action. At the moment, all the numbers are going the wrong way, and there are endless political distractions around the world. I think just a talking shop is not going to do it.
It's not going to do it. Action's going to do it.
Great.
It's not going to do it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Isabel Hilton, Matthew Wittenmeyer, and Charles Miller. Such a pity, Ms. Hilton, but we'll talk to you later on other occasions as well. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
I look forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.